This is episode 14, where we unpack the idea of God as both mystery and lawgiver, and why morality might not need divine approval after all. Welcome to this deep dive.
Great to be here. We're jumping into some really interesting material today, pulling from excerpts of Yuval Noah Harari's 21 Lessons for the 21st Century.
And our mission is to explore how Harari looks at the concept of God in two very distinct ways, and then crucially dive into his argument about where morality actually comes from, suggesting it might not be rooted in divine command at all.
Yeah, it's quite a provocative take. So Harari starts by drawing a really sharp distinction. He sees two fundamentally different ways people talk about God.
Okay, what are they?
Well, first is the one he calls the cosmic mystery.
The cosmic mystery, what's that about?
Think of it as the grand, awesome enigma, the ultimate why. Why is there something rather than nothing? What are the fundamental laws of physics? Where does consciousness come from? It's, the God we invoke when we hit the absolute limits of our understanding.
Right. The God of philosophers, maybe? Or those late-night campfire talks where you're just grappling with the sheer scale of it all. It's like God as a placeholder for profound ignorance, almost.
Exactly. It's defined by what we don't know. It's awesome in the true sense of the word, inspiring awe, because it's so far beyond us.
Okay, so that's one. But you said there's another very different character in the text.
Oh, yeah. The worldly lawgiver.
Worldly lawgiver.
Yeah.
Sounds less mysterious.
Completely different. This God is the opposite. About this one, Harari says, people claim to know way too much. This is presented as a stern figure deeply personally invested in human affairs.
How so?
Well, we're told.
Yeah.
He has very specific opinions on, everything. Fashion, food, sex, politics, you name it. It's often portrayed as that angry man in the sky, the one invoked to justify rules, decrees, and unfortunately, conflicts.
So this is the God that, according to some interpretations presented in the text, gets genuinely upset about, I don't know, women wearing short sleeves, or certain kinds of sex, or even teenagers masturbating.
That's precisely the picture Harari paints. The text highlights the incredible detail. We're talking entire libraries, supposedly filled with divine regulations, what you can eat, who you can sleep with, how you should dress, even what thoughts are okay. Very specific, often quite trifling demands.
Not exactly cosmic scale stuff.
Not at all. And this, the text argues, is the God associated with crusaders, jihadists, inquisitors, the God invoked by misogynists and homophobes, sometimes even around, burning pyres. A stark contrast to the unknowable mystery.
Okay, so two very different concepts. Where does the problem come in, according to Harari?
The problem lies in what he sees as a critical and frankly illogical conflation.
You mean mixing them up, how people slide from one to the other?
Exactly. People often start with the awe, the mystery. They'll say something like, look, science can't explain the Big Bang or consciousness. It must be God, invoking that profound, unknowable force.
Okay, starting with the big mystery.
Right. But then, almost in the next breath, without any kind of logical bridge, they jump straight to the worldly lawgiver.
And suddenly, that same cosmic mystery is being used to justify very specific, very human rules, like, because we can't explain quantum physics, therefore you need to cover your hair, or vote against gay marriage.
Precisely. It's presented as a kind of bait and switch. Harari finds it deeply contradictory. He asks, how likely is it, really, that the vast, mysterious force behind galaxy formation and the laws of thermodynamics is intensely preoccupied with human fashion choices or sexual habits?
Yeah, when you put it like that, it seems like a huge leap. So how do people make that connection? What bridges that gap between the mystery and the rules?
Well, the text points squarely at holy books. They're presented as the main mechanism for this conflation.
The idea being that these books, often filled with what Harari calls trifling regulations, are presented as the direct word of the creator of the entire universe.
That's the claim the text examines. The creator of Imeso, supposedly dictating detailed dietary laws or specific rituals. Harari really pushes on this, pointing out there's, zero evidence presented that books like the Bible or the Quran or the Vedas were actually composed by the same entity that fine-tuned the gravitational constant.
Right. Instead, the text argues these were written by humans. Imaginative humans, sure, but humans nonetheless. And they wrote them to establish social norms, create shared stories, and legitimize political structures in their specific time and place.
And Harari is pretty upfront about his own view here. He says he marvels at the cosmic mystery, finds it deeply awe-inspiring. But he sees absolutely no connection between that mystery and the the niggling laws, as he puts it, found in specific religion.
He does acknowledge those laws were important for social order, historically speaking.
Oh, definitely. He grants that they help structure societies, create cooperation. But, he argues, they function much like secular laws or constitutions do as human-created systems for order, not necessarily because they came from a cosmic source.
This leads him to reinterpret a famous commandment, doesn't it? The one about not taking God's name in vain.
Yes, and it's a really interesting take. He suggests we often miss the deeper meaning.
Going beyond just, not swearing using God's name.
Far beyond that, Harari proposes the real meaning, the more profound violation, is using God's name to cloak your own worldly agendas, your political ambitions, your economic goals, your personal hatreds and prejudices.
So, saying, God hates this group, when really it's you who hates them. Or God wants us to conquer this land when you just want the resources or territory.
Exactly that. Claiming divine sanction for your own desires. The text puts it quite bluntly. If you want to wage war, if you want to steal, fine, but leave God out of it. Find another excuse. He argues the world would genuinely be a better place if people followed that interpretation.
It's a powerful reframing, and he clarifies his own language use too, right?
Yeah, he says that when he uses the word God, he's generally referring to that worldly lawgiver, the one invoked in the Crusades by ISIS during the Inquisition, the one on signs saying God hates fags.
But for the big, unknowable mystery.
He consciously tries to use other words, like cosmic mystery or the enigma of existence, precisely to avoid that very confusion. Because the mystery, by its nature, is beyond names. It doesn't care what label we put on it. The worldly lawgiver, though, is depicted as being intensely concerned with its specific name and how it's used.
Okay, this distinction is really clear, and it leads perfectly into the next massive question the text tackles. If we set aside the worldly lawgiver as a human construct, and the cosmic mystery doesn't give us rules, well, can morality even exist without God? This whole idea of godless ethics.
It's a huge question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And a common concern. Many people genuinely believe that without a divine lawgiver handing down commandments, society would just, collapse, utter chaos. Why would anyone be good?
The text does acknowledge that belief in gods has been vital for social order historically, and it sometimes did lead to positive outcomes, like inspiring compassion.
Definitely. It gives a really striking example, actually, from the 1960s in California. A Methodist minister, Reverend Ted McElvenna.
What did he do?
Well, this was a time of intense prejudice against LGBT people, and McElvenna felt a strong calling to address their suffering. He brought together clergy from various Protestant denominations, Methodists, Episcopalians, Lutherans, UCC, along with gay activists.
That sounds pretty radical for the early 60s.
It absolutely was, and they formed the Council on Religion and the Homosexual, or CRH. Apparently, it was the first organization in the U.S. to actually use the word homosexual in its name.
Wow. And the point of this example is?
The point is that these religious leaders consciously chose to prioritize what they saw as the core, compassionate spirit of Christ over the literal, strict biblical condemnations of homosexuality found in their scriptures. They felt a moral imperative rooted in compassion that, in their view, superseded specific divine rules.
So their faith inspired moral action, but by interpreting or even overriding the supposed literal commands of the worldly lawgiver in their texts.
Exactly. Which supports the text's core argument. Religious faith can inspire morality, but it's not a necessary precondition. You don't need it to be moral.
Because the text argues that morality is in some way natural, not something imposed from outside.
That's the claim. It pushes back hard against the idea that humans are inherently immoral beasts only kept in line by divine threats. It suggests morality, or at least the foundations for it, are part of our nature.
It points to other social animals, right? Like chimps or even rats having basic ethical codes, rules against stealing food within the group, or random violence.
Yeah, basic forms of fairness and reciprocity seen in other species.
Yeah.
And then, look at humans. Every single society, everywhere, throughout history, has developed moral codes. Whether they believe in one god, many gods, or no gods, morality is a human universal.
The text makes comparisons too, doesn't it? Like, Christians act charitably without needing to believe in Hindu gods. Muslims value honesty even if they don't accept Christ's divinity.
Right, and it points to modern secular countries, think Denmark, the Czech Republic, arguing they aren't demonstrably more violent or immoral than highly religious countries like Iran or Pakistan. Sometimes quite the opposite, in fact.
So if morality isn't about following divine commands, what is it about, according to Harari?
It boils down to something simple yet profound: reducing suffering.
Okay, that's a shift. Morality as suffering reduction, not rule following.
Exactly. And to act morally from this perspective, you don't need faith in a particular story or God. What you need, the text argues, is a deep, visceral appreciation of what suffering is, both in yourself and in others.
And the idea is if you genuinely understand how an action causes unnecessary pain, either to yourself or someone else, you'll naturally steer clear of it.
That's the theory. If causing harm feels intrinsically bad to you because you connect with the suffering involved, you won't want to do it. It's based on empathy and understanding, not just obedience.
But I mean, people do inflict terrible suffering all the time. War, cruelty, exploitation. If it's so natural to avoid causing suffering, why does this happen constantly?
The text suggests it's because our appreciation of suffering is often shallow or blocked. We get fixated on immediate gratification, greed, lust, anger, power, and we lose sight of the impact on others, or even the long-term negative consequences for ourselves.
It mentions techniques people use to distance themselves,
Yeah.
right? Like dehumanizing victims.
Yeah, things inquisitors or torturers might do psychologically, separating themselves from the victim's pain to make the act possible. It's about short-circuiting that natural empathetic response.
Okay, but this still brings up a core question. Maybe the core question for godless ethics. Fine, I don't want to suffer, but why should I really care about someone else's suffering, especially a stranger, if there's no God telling me I have to? Isn't self-interest primary?
That's the crucial challenge, absolutely. Why extend care beyond yourself and your immediate circle without a divine command? The text offers, essentially, three naturalistic answers.
Okay, what's the first?
First, we're fundamentally social creatures. Our happiness isn't just about us, it's deeply tied to our relationships. Love, friendship, belonging to a community. A purely selfish, isolated life is usually a miserable one. So, caring for family, friends, our community, it's not just altruism, it's part of our own recipe for a good life.
Right, that makes sense for people we know and care about. But the stranger, why not steal their wallet if I can get away with it?
That brings us to the second answer. Broader, long-term self-interest. Would you actually want to live in a society where people routinely robbed or attacked strangers? Probably not. You'd live in fear, and all the benefits of social cooperation like trade, innovation, mutual support, things that rely on trust, would collapse.
So it's a kind of pragmatic realization. A society where people generally don't harm strangers is better for everyone, including me. That's like a secular golden rule.
Pretty much. Don't do unto others. Because you don't want to live in the kind of world where that's the norm. It's enlightened self-interest on a societal scale. But there's a third answer too, which the text presents as maybe even more fundamental and immediate.
Okay, what's that?
It's the idea that hurting others always hurts you too. And often, it hurts you first.
How does that work? If I punch someone, they feel the pain, not me initially.
Physically, yes. But think about where the act comes from. To inflict harm, especially out of anger or hatred, requires you to cultivate those negative states within your own mind. Greed, envy, rage, malice. These are inherently unpleasant, disturbing mental states. They poison your peace of mind long before the punch lands, or even if it never lands.
So the anger itself is a form of suffering for the person feeling it,
Sure.
regardless of whether they act on it.
Exactly. You can't be boiling with hatred and simultaneously feel serene and happy. It's impossible. The text argues that our natural desire for our own inner peace should be the strongest motivation to work on these negative emotions. Not because God said don't be angry, but because anger feels awful, and being free from it feels intrinsically better.
Finding peace by letting go of anger is actually a greater reward for me than getting revenge on an enemy.
That's the perspective offered. It frames morality, even compassion for others, as being deeply rooted in understanding our own internal landscape and seeking our own well-being, properly understood.
Now, the text is careful to acknowledge that belief can help here. Believing in a compassionate God who commands forgiveness or turning the other cheek has helped countless people manage anger and act kindly.
Absolutely. It recognizes that as a significant positive contribution of many religious traditions, a genuinely useful tool for cultivating virtue for many people.
But it immediately follows with the flip side. Religious belief can also be incredibly effective at stoking anger and justifying hatred, especially if people feel their God or his specific rules have been insulted or challenged.
Right. So the ultimate value judgment in the text isn't on belief itself, but on the behavior it produces. If belief in a lawgiver, God, makes people act with compassion and fairness, then functionally it's a positive force for them and society. If it leads to violence and intolerance, then it's harmful.
And the same applies to rituals or sacred places. Their value isn't inherent, but depends on what they inspire.
Exactly. If going to a temple brings someone peace and motivates them to be kinder, that's wonderful. If that same temple becomes a focal point for inciting hatred or violence against others, then from this perspective, it's become dysfunctional, maybe even something to be avoided.
Which leads logically to the text's concluding thought on this whole section.
Which is that choosing not to visit temples, choosing not to believe in any particular god or gods, is presented as a completely viable path to a moral life.
The argument being that history, especially recent centuries, shows we don't actually need God's name or divine commands to build ethical societies and live moral lives.
Yes. The text asserts that secular frameworks based on reason, empathy, understanding suffering, and that enlightened self-interest we discussed can provide all the necessary values for a fully functioning, compassionate moral code.
So let's try to wrap up this deep dive. We've really unpacked Harari's core ideas here, that sharp distinction between the unknowable cosmic mystery and the all-too-knowable worldly lawgiver.
We looked at how they get conflated, often via holy books, creating what he sees as a logical inconsistency.
And then we spent a good chunk of time on the really fascinating argument for a natural, potentially godless basis for morality, one centered not on obeying divine rules, but on the concrete goal of reducing suffering.
Grounded in our social nature, our capacity for empathy, and even our own desire for inner peace. We saw examples of religious people prioritizing compassion over doctrine and secular societies functioning morally.
It really leaves you, the listener, with something to think about. Consider the text's core argument. Is morality fundamentally about reducing suffering? Does framing it that way change how you think about ethical choices, regardless of your own beliefs about a divine lawgiver?
Maybe, as the text ultimately suggests, the deepest path to living morally isn't necessarily found in ancient scriptures or divine commands, but in the very human, very natural process of truly understanding suffering in ourselves and in others.